Good afternoon. I'm Alan Altshuler. I'm a professor here at the Graduate School of Design and also at the Kennedy School. And it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker, John Pucher. This afternoon is a particular privilege because I first encountered John when he was a graduate student and I chaired his doctoral dissertation committee. And so I have had the great pleasure of watching with pride all of his accomplishments in the years since. This event, let me say before I say a few words about John, is co-sponsored by 7 organizations. So I won't give you a full briefing on all of these organizations, but they are the Kennedy School, the Graduate School of Design, the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, Walk Boston, Mass Bike. Is there another word beyond Mass Bike, or is Mass Bike it? Livable Streets Alliance, and the Boston Cyclists Union. So John, we were just talking about this. John has really hit a topic that is at the center of the interests of vast numbers of people across the country. He may even get rich off this book. John is a professor, as most of you know, at the School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers, and he is a genuinely world-renowned specialist in urban transportation economics and finance. For over 3 decades, he has examined differences in travel behavior, transport systems, and transport policies in Europe, Canada, the United States, and Australia. In addition to his pure scholarly research, he's done numerous projects for the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Canadian government, and various European ministries of transport. John is an enormously prolific author who has produced over 100 articles in academic and professional journals, and has also authored or co-authored, I guess in all cases you've co-authored 3 books. In the first of those cases, he co-authored a part of a book that I was the lead author on back in 1979 called The Urban Transportation System. Then he and Christian Lefebvre published in 1996 The Urban Transport Crisis in Europe and North America, a particularly very interesting book. And, of course, his latest book, which is the subject of his talk today, and there it is, if you look, John waving it there, is entitled City Cycling, Urban and Industrial Environments, and the official publication date, I believe, is this Friday. And that is the title of his talk today, Promoting Cycling and Walking for Sustainable Cities, Lessons from Europe and North America. John?
Thank you very much, Alan. Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming to this talk. It's a beautiful day, and I'd rather be out there cycling somewhere, to tell you the truth. So thanks for coming indoors in spite of the nice weather. As you can see from the first slide here, the topic is walking and cycling. And by assumption, I believe that it is really something important to do to promote walking and cycling, to increase levels of walking and cycling in the United States and in other parts of the world as well. For decades, certainly in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, I think that walking and cycling were probably the most neglected modes of transportation. They weren't really considered at all as part of the transportation system. We focused on highways, on transit, and sort of forgot walking and cycling. Well, all of a sudden, they've been rediscovered. And more over the past 20 or 30 years, but especially over the last 10, 15 years, we've been starting to recognize the importance of walking and cycling for a number of reasons. I know there may be some people here in the audience who disagree with my proposals for ways to increase walking and cycling, but I hope we at least agree on the overall goal of increasing walking and cycling to produce, in fact, more livable, more sustainable, more socially just cities. Why should we encourage more walking and cycling? Because they are indeed the most sustainable modes of transportation. What do we mean by sustainability? It's not just environmentally friendly. They are environmentally friendly. There's no question that walking and cycling are the most environmentally friendly modes of transportation. No pollution, very little in the way of resources used. They are also socially sustainable. There are actually 3 dimensions of sustainability, according to the World Bank, and I agree with the World Bank. There's environmental sustainability, there's social sustainability, and there's financial or economic sustainability. On every dimension, walking and cycling are the most sustainable. So what about social sustainability? They're equitable. Walking and cycling, virtually almost everyone can certainly afford to walk and to bike. You don't have to get a $5,000 carbon fiber bike. You can get one for $50 or $100. So it's financially affordable to virtually everyone, different income levels, and it's physically possible by a wide range of the population. It also doesn't cost very much. It doesn't cost much for the individual, and it doesn't cost much for society as a whole. It costs much less to build a bike lane. It even costs much less to build a cycle track than it does to build a new roadway or a new transit line in most cases. In addition to those benefits, social, economic, and environmental benefits, there are tremendous health benefits of walking and cycling. These are really healthy ways of getting around. And by the way, although there are some traffic risks of walking and cycling, there have been a number of studies over the past few years which prove unequivocally that the health benefits of walking and cycling far offset the traffic risks of walking and cycling. Why are they so great? Because you can build walking and cycling into your daily routine. You don't think about, oh, I'm going to walk and cycle to get that physical activity. Turns out physical activity is really, really important for your health. I have a confession, and that is when I was a kid, and even now, I hate gyms. I just hate gyms. I hate calisthenics. I hate gyms. They're torture chambers as far as I'm concerned, but I love walking and cycling. And I get, without even thinking about getting physical activity, I build that walking and cycling into my daily routine, and it means I get a lot more than just the 30 minutes recommended every day by the Centers for Disease Prevention and Control. Well, it turns out we have tremendous differences in levels of walking and cycling among different countries, even of very high income levels. So you'll see, not surprising, the Netherlands has the highest level of walking and cycling here. They have over half of all trips by walking or cycling. Denmark is number 2 with over 30-something% of all trips by walking and cycling. And then we are here in the United States. If you look at all trip purposes way over to the left there, if you're wondering which one, if it's just for the commute to work, it's 0.6%. And if it is for all trip purposes, it's about 12% or so of trips are by walking and cycling, but much, much lower levels than you see in these countries in Europe. About a third, just roughly a third to a fourth of the levels of walking and cycling that you have in Western Europe. Well, there's variation among countries. There's also tremendous variation among cities within each country. There's also variation in regions, among regions of a country. If you look here at the United States, you can look at any of these, and we're not going to look at any of these in detail because it would take too long, but you can see that's tremendous variation, whether it's Australia, the United States, Canada, or the UK. You might wonder, you'll see a little bit later, but you do pretty well here in Cambridge. You have about 7% of all workers get to work by bike in Cambridge as their main means of transportation every day. And that is that's actually more than Portland, the famous city for cycling, and it's a little bit less in Boulder, Colorado. In Somerville, you're number 2. And you're about 5%, so you're between Portland and Minneapolis. So even here in the Boston area, you actually compete fairly well in terms of Cambridge and Somerville with some of these other cities in the United States. We have variation within the North American continent, something that may astound you here. The darker the shade, the more workers bike to work. This is the percentage of workers. This is both from the Canadian census and the US census. And both censuses define this as a percentage, mode share as a percentage of workers. So it's not a percentage of trips, but percentage of workers bicycling as the main mode of transportation to get to work. And you can see that it's about 2 to 3 times higher in Canada than in the United States. Curious, isn't it? You might think that in a cold country, such as at least parts of Canada, that you would have less cycling. But what's even more astounding is look up there at the Northern Territories and the Yukon Territory, which have the highest level of cycling of all. Well, the climate itself is not the main thing that's deterring or promoting cycling. It's a matter of in those territories, actually in the Northwest, you have very compact settlements. You have sort of people living few and far between, but they're compact. They're sort of clustered together. And the other reason, by the way, why Canada has so much more cycling than the United States, and by the way, also more walking and more transit use, is cities and suburbs in Canada are 2 to 3 times denser than they are in the United States, so that the median trip distance to get to work in Canada is half of what it is in the United States. So land use planning is an important way of encouraging cycling and walking as well. Some encouraging news is there's been tremendous increases in cycling in many cities around the world, even in many very large cities. So you can see Berlin, the largest city in Germany, a doubling in the percentage of people riding around by bikes from 5% to 10% of all trips. That's a big jump, 5% to 10% in the biggest city in Germany. But even cities such as, say, Amsterdam and Copenhagen, which you assume, oh, well, they were just always bicycling oriented. It's just not true. They weren't. And they've made, year by year, steady improvements in their bicycling network to make cycling safer, more convenient, more feasible for every segment of the population. And you can see what's happened. They've jumped from about 25% of trips to 37, 38% of all trips. So progress is certainly possible, and even in some very large cities, it's been possible to tremendously increase levels of cycling. A different scale here, because the range of the numbers is different, but Portland is the #1 big city in the United States at 6% of all workers getting to work by bike. Minneapolis, #2, another really warm tropical city. So again, cold winters don't necessarily deter having a bike-oriented city. Portland is also probably the rainiest city in the United States, so neither rain nor cold, no wind or whatever the post office says. You can have a rainy city, you can have a cold city, and yet have a thriving bicycle culture. And you can see the increases in these other cities as well. And now look at Cambridge. We are in the city of Cambridge, in case you didn't know. And there's been almost a quadrupling, a 3.5-fold increase in cycling here in the city of Cambridge since 2002. So that's in a period of 10 years, almost a 4-fold increase in cycling. I think that's a tremendous improvement. And just as in those countries and those cities that have shown a tremendous increase in cycling, it hasn't happened by accident. It's not because of demographic shifts. It's because those cities have invested a lot in cycling infrastructure and in cycling programs. Training programs, law enforcement programs, promotional programs, marketing programs, as well as vast improvements in cycling infrastructure. And a lot of that you can see on the streets right here in Cambridge. We did a study for the U.S. Department of Transportation, specifically looking at 9 large cities in Canada and the United States. And as you can see in this, there were tremendous increases in cycling in each of these 9 cities, from a low level, admittedly. New York City sort of brags about how much cycling they have. It's actually only 0.6%, but still it's a doubling since 1990. If you look at a city such as Chicago, you have a quadrupling, you have, I think it's a tripling in Washington, D.C., but significant increases in all of these cities. And in every one of these cities, it hasn't, again, I'll say it again, hasn't happened by accident. It has happened because of a deliberate policy decision. We want to promote cycling. We are going to invest in the cycling infrastructure. We're going to invest in the cycling programs necessary to complement the cycling infrastructure. So that's sort of the good news. It is possible to increase cycling even in sprawled metropolitan areas such as in the United States. But not so surprisingly, in every single one of these 9 metropolitan areas, the levels of cycling in the suburbs are much lower than they are in the center of the city. What you're actually seeing here, the orange bar is the level of, it's the percentage of workers, again, getting to work by bike, that's for the metropolitan area as a whole. The darker bar is for the center of the city. So not surprisingly, the centers of the city are more compact, shorter trip distances, and you get more cycling. You see this even more dramatically when you do GIS maps. I didn't do this, my students do it. Did it for me. I think GIS is a great technology. I just don't master it. But I think it really shows very graphically in New York City just how concentrated cycling is. It's not just that it's concentrated in the central city of New York compared to the metropolitan area, but even within the 5 boroughs of New York City, it's really, really concentrated in lower Manhattan and northwest Brooklyn. That's where it's really, really thriving. And once you go out to Staten Island or eastern Brooklyn or Queens or the Bronx, you get almost no cycling at all. So it's very spatially concentrated. In the District of Columbia, The same sort of a thing. It doesn't show up in quite the same way because you have a lower population. But you can see even within the district itself, over there east of the Anacostia River, which is Anacostia, you see almost no cycling whatsoever. It's within the same city, almost zero. When you go to the northwest, much, much higher levels of cycling, especially in northwest Washington itself, but even in the northwestern suburbs, more cycling. So both distance to the center can affect cycling levels, but also the direction from the center can make a difference as well. And then I was curious, well, how do the different communities here in the Boston metropolitan area compare? Well, there are big, big, big differences. Here you have, this is, by the way, excluding people who work at home, but if you exclude them, you get 7.2% of all trips in Cambridge are, of all workers are getting to work by bike. You have I can't read it here, 4.8% in Somerville and so forth. Huge differences. For the region as a whole, 0.8%. For the Boston city, it's 1.5%. So you know, a range of 10 to 1. And I'm not exactly sure why we chose Norwood, but there were literally 0 cyclists biking to work in Norwood. I'm not sure exactly how that's possible. This is a 5-year running average. To increase the sample size, and yet they didn't find a single person biking to work in Norwood. I don't know how that's possible. Well, this is another GIS map, compliments of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council here in the Boston area. And you can see here the spatial variation and levels of walking within the official metropolitan area of Boston. You can see it's really dramatic. Again, higher levels in the center of the city, such as you would see in New York as well. If you look at cycling, again, considerable spatial variation. There are some exceptions. So you go up to the northwest and you find a little sort of a cluster of cycling up there. But overall, you can see it's centered more in the central part of the Boston metropolitan area. One of the good parts of the news, first of all, I've sort of shown you evidence it is possible to increase levels of cycling. Many cities, many countries have been successful in increasing cycling over the past 20 years and making it safer. And some Americans say, well, that's nice for Europe, but I don't think that's very feasible for the United States. Well, as it turns out, 27% of all trips in our very sprawled American metropolitan areas are a mile or shorter, and 41% are 2 miles or shorter. Well, for me at least, a bike trip of 2 miles is nothing. I mean, I yawn and I've covered 2 miles practically. It's very easy to cover 2 miles on a bike. And for me, a mile walking doesn't seem that long either. So I think that many, many, many of our trips, in fact, even in our sprawled American metropolitan areas, are feasible potentially to be made by walking and by biking. So that's sort of the good news. Some of you might think, well, one of the reasons that you have so much more biking and walking in these European cities is they're just denser. It's sort of historically determined. They're more compact, they have shorter trip distances. Part of that's true. What we did, though, in this particular case, is we controlled for that. We controlled for trip distance, and we said, well, let's take these 4 countries, USA, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, and look at controlling for trip distance within each trip distance category, how many trips, what percentage of all trips, this is for all trip purposes now, by the way, not for work trips, for all trip purposes, what percentage are made by walking and cycling. And you see that at the shorter, the weird categories, I admit, but I won't explain why they're so weird, but we had to make them comparable. But you can see that for the shorter trip distance of 0 to 2.5 kilometers, as maybe 1 to 1.5 miles, you find levels of walking and cycling that are about twice as high in the 3 European countries. But when you go to the slightly larger, I mean, go to 2.5 to 5 kilometers and 5 to 7.5 kilometers, the differences become 10 to 1 or 20 to 1. So this, again, is controlling for trip distance. Even within each trip distance category, the Dutch, the Danes, and the Germans cycle for a much, much higher percentage of their trips. The Europeans also cycle for a much wider range of trip purposes. About 70% of our bike trips in the United States are recreational. I have nothing against recreational cycling. I do it myself. But it's interesting that Europeans tend to cycle much more for utilitarian, daily purposes, getting to work, getting to school, doing shopping, visiting friends, and so forth. In Denmark, it was like less than 10% of bike trips in Denmark are for recreation. And I couldn't believe the statistics. So I asked Linda Christensen, who is the head of statistics for the Department of Transport in Copenhagen, this can't be true. She says, we Danes, we bike for really serious purposes. We don't just bike for recreation. So anyway, different cycling. The Europeans really bike for a much wider range of purposes than we do here in the United States. Now we come to a really important point, women. Women are the key to the success of cycling. I will tell you that right now at the outset. There are huge differences among countries, among cities, and among parts of cities in the percentage of bike trips made by women. If you look at the 3 European countries here, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, there's almost no gender difference at all. You have, in fact, in Denmark, you have more women cycling than you have men cycling. And just about the same, you have 56% in the Netherlands. So again, that's more women cycling than you have men cycling, and it's about 50-50 in Germany. Well, here you can see in the United States, the UK, and in Canada, it's about 30%, in the US, about 25%. So why is it that you have that? It certainly is not the case that men are built for cycling and women aren't built for cycling. It just can't be. You can see that's not the case because you can look at the European countries where women cycle even more than men do. If you look at different cities, so we've already seen these big differences in gender in terms of cycling for different countries. Now look at different cities around the world. The same holds true. Note that, one thing I wanted to emphasize here, that where women cycle the most is where people in general cycle the most. That is, an overall high bike mode share, such as you have in Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. Also, those countries are where you have as many women cycling or more women cycling than you have men cycling. The exact same pattern holds if you look at different cities. So here you have this graph, and what it's showing is that the higher the percentage of total bike trips made by women, the higher the overall bike mode share for that city. So getting women on bikes is the key to the success of cycling. And if that doesn't convince you, so we've had it at the country level, we've had it at the city level, now this is at the neighborhood level. And this is a graph that was used by one of my great colleagues, Jan Gerard, down in Melbourne, Australia. And you can see here, these are different neighborhoods in the Melbourne metropolitan area. And the same exact relationship holds again. Where the percentage of women cycling is high, the overall mode share of cycling is very high. Now, there's a chapter in the book about women and cycling. It was written by my 3 wonderful colleagues and co-authors, Jan Gerard, Susan Handy, and Jennifer Dill, and they consider women to be the indicator species for cycling. It's their term. I would not have written a chapter about women and cycling myself. But these 3 women, it's their term. They said, if you want to get people on bikes, listen to women, ask them what they want, and give it to them. That's the key. Because they say if you can get women on bikes, it probably means you can also get kids on bikes, seniors on bikes, people who are risk averse on bikes. What they found in a number of studies is that women tend to be more risk averse than men. I'm also, by the way, quite risk averse, but also kids or the parents of kids and also seniors tend to be risk averse. Most people, I think, tend to be risk averse when it comes to cycling. So if you can produce an environment, create an environment where cycling feels safe and where it is safe and where it's comfortable, you are also going to encourage not just women to cycle, but also seniors and children and people like me who are risk averse. This is just confirming again. This is a picture by Susan Handy, one of my colleagues at UC Davis. You might note no one's wearing a helmet. I'm not sure if I like the idea of the iPods, except that I own Apple stock. But this is, by the way, this particular facility it's a crossing here of an intersection. It's actually a cycle track, but you can't see it because they're crossing an intersection. Over 55,000 bike trips a year per day are on that one facility. I don't think there's anything in the United States that comes close to that. Another important issue here is age, both in terms of children and in terms of seniors. Most of you in this audience are too young to know or to realize what it's like to get older. But as we get older, and we are all getting older at the rate of 1 day per day, 1 year per year, you will eventually all be old, like it or not. You should hope to be able to become old. But what's interesting here is many Americans would think, well, once you're old, you really can't bike anymore. You're going to be less likely to walk. I think something that's amazing. Look at this here. It's showing the percentage of all trips made by biking and walking in the Germany, Denmark, Netherlands compared to the United States and the UK. Notice, it increases as people get older. Look, for example, at Denmark. For people who are 70 to 84 years old, 15% of their trips are by bike and 21% of their trips by walking. In the Netherlands, people 65 and over half of their trips made by walking or bicycling. What does that do? I mean, it's not that it's just good for the environment. It's good for their health. It gives them mobility. It gives them independence. And folks, I think this really is truly a matter of social justice, because we're saying that if we provide a walking and a cycling environment that is safe and comfortable and convenient and feasible for everyone, we're serving really all age groups, all income groups, men as well as women. We're really being socially inclusive, and that means more mobility, more independence, more equality in mobility for all of our population. So yes, all age groups can cycle, different shapes of people can cycle. So I think my goal would be to make cycling possible, and especially in terms of making it safe for everyone, because I think safety in terms of cycling especially is probably the main deterrent to getting people on a bike. If you ask people, why aren't you biking? Oh, I just don't think it's safe. I'm afraid to get on the bike. I'm going to get hit by a car. Well, when you look at different safety rates in different countries, you can see that in those countries where you have very high levels of cycling, you have much, much safer cycling. Now, something that might be a shocker for some of you, maybe not. And these are from official government statistics. These are not statistics I made up. Really not. They're from either ministries of transport, departments of transportation. They're the official government statistics for each of these countries. And what we're seeing here is different rates, safety or traffic fatality rates, and injury rates for walking and biking in these various countries. If you look at the Netherlands and Denmark, you can see they do really, really, really well. Walking and cycling in the Netherlands and Denmark is about 10 times safer than it is in the United States. Now, when it comes to cycling, and I can't see here exactly what colors those are, but there are two bars. One is cycling fatalities, the other is cycling injuries. And you can see that on both respects, the Netherlands and Denmark are much, 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 much safer than the United States. I will just note, and we'll come back to this point later in the lecture, those countries have by far the most extensive system of physically separate cycling facilities of any countries in the world. Much, much, much more extensive than anything any city has in the United States. And they're called cycle tracks. I mean, they're different sort of designs, but basically it's this notion of a cycle track or a physically separated cycling facility. So it's interesting. I'm not saying it's the only reason, because they have a whole package of programs that contributes to the safety. But it's interesting that those two countries with the world's most extensive system of cycle tracks, of physically separate cycle facilities, have the safest cycling in the world. You might think that it was always safe in Europe. Not true. Again, this is sort of a misconception that walking and cycling were always safe and convenient and feasible and just the thing to do in Europe, and it's just not true. You can see tremendous progress here over time. This is all relative to the year 1970. Tremendous decline here in cyclist fatalities in these European countries, and almost no decrease. It sort of goes up and down. It ends up being almost about 100%. In the United States, what's happened is there's fewer child cyclist fatalities because kids don't bike anymore, and there's more adult cyclist fatalities because most of the increase has been in adult cycling. So they sort of offset each other, so there's just not been that much of a change. Well, you have this boom in cycling in Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, and in spite of the fact that you have many, many more cyclists and more bike trips, tremendous declines here. This is like a 60 to 80% decline in cyclist fatalities since 1970. Real progress. Lots of progress also in reducing pedestrian fatalities. Unfortunately, even for the European countries, some of this is due to decreased levels of walking. There has been a certain amount of substitution of cycling for walking, as even European cities tend to spread out a little bit more than they used to be. But even here you can see that we've had much more progress in the European countries in terms of reducing pedestrian fatalities and making walking safer than it was before. There's an important notion called safety in numbers, and that is as more people walk and more people cycle, we become, as pedestrians and cyclists, more visible to motorists. That increased visibility is absolutely crucial to safety. As you increase the numbers of people walking and cycling, you increase the visibility. You also increase the percentage of motorists who are at some time either a pedestrian or a cyclist, and therefore more sensitive to the needs of pedestrians and cyclists. In our study for the U.S. Department of Transportation, we had these 9 case study cities, and this particular principle, if you want to call it that, of cycling safety in numbers certainly holds. That is, where it's the most dangerous, which is New York City, you have the least cycling as a mode share, and where you have the most cycling, it's the least dangerous, in Vancouver, Portland, Minneapolis, and so forth. So on the city level, it holds. Something very interesting in Portland. Again, I want to emphasize these things don't happen by themselves. Public policies are absolutely crucial to getting more people on bikes and to making cycling safer. Well, over time, there's been this tremendous increase in cycling in Portland. I already told you this, more than a 6-fold increase, as a matter of fact. Almost no increase at all in the number of serious bicyclist injuries and fatalities. Almost level. What does this mean? Tremendous decrease in the cyclist crash rate. In short, cycling in Portland has become 6 to 7 times safer per bike trip than it was back in 1991. That's tremendous progress. And so it's sort of a chicken and egg issue. Well, what led to what? On the one hand, you have more cycling because of a lot of programs that have encouraged more cycling. As you have had more cycling, cycling's also become safer because of the safety in numbers factor. So it's been a very positive development, and you see this in city after city. We've looked at this in so many cities. Peter Jacobsman, who was sort of the person who developed this concept of safety in numbers, has looked at this in different countries, at certain cities over time, and it always has held. You increase levels of cycling, it makes it safer and safer. As I say already, public policies are absolutely crucial, and it was not the case that European cities always had such friendly policies toward walking and cycling. In the 50s and 1960s, you had sort of an attempt to adopt a pro-auto policy, sort of copying what we were doing in the United States. More parking lots, more highways, more expressways, and so forth, basically adapting the city to the automobile. They discovered that it was a disaster for the centers of the cities, and there was a dramatic turnaround in public policy in these Dutch, Danish, and German cities. Just absolutely dramatic. And for me to say dramatic is one thing, but to show it makes the point better. This is a bridge in Freiburg, Germany in the 1960s. This is what it looks like today. They simply took it away from cars and gave it to cyclists. Good idea, as far as I can tell. But I mean, it's just a visible representation of how policies changed. This is an even more important, it maybe doesn't look quite as dramatic, but it's even more important. Virtually every single street in the city of Freiburg has been traffic calmed. To the left is before traffic calming. You have cars parked on the sidewalks blocking pedestrians. It's an ugly street. It's certainly not an attractive street to walk or to bike on. The exact same street, it's called Kladerstrasse in Freiburg, is on the right-hand side. They've traffic calmed the street. They've narrowed it. They provide benches for people to sit, bike parking. They have trees. They have human-scaled lighting. They have everything possible. And again, over 90% of the residential streets in Freiburg are traffic calmed like this. What does this do? It makes that street into a street you can walk or bike on safely without any cycling facility at all. You can just simply walk on it without being afraid of getting hit by a car. Another example of the shift in policy, this is again actually in Freiburg. To the left is the Cathedral Square in the 1960s. It was nothing but parked cars. It was a parking lot. Well, they got rid of the cars and put in it's actually a daily market that they have in Freiburg, so they made it into a car-free zone. Actually, Freiburg has one of the largest car-free zones in Germany, and one of the earliest as well. Well, you can do some good things here in Cambridge as well. And you can see here on Mass Ave that you had sort of a road diet, and so you had a narrowing. You reduced one of the lanes of traffic for motor vehicles. You close off that street altogether. You have a nicer pedestrian crossing. I'm not going to say it's perfect. I'm not going to claim that it couldn't possibly be improved. If it were up to me, I would put in a cycle track, but that's another issue. The point is, it's progress. It's a step in the right direction. This goes with almost everything you can see here in the Boston or Cambridge or Somerville. It's not that what's being done is perfect, but it's certainly better than what was before, and it's a step in the right direction. Copenhagen, I'll tell you later, but I mean, if you hear Jan Gehl talk, he's a city planner in Copenhagen and an urban designer, and he will tell you it took 30, 40 years for Copenhagen to do what it did. So we're making a very good start. Now, this is a pet peeve of mine. I have walked over this Longfellow Bridge hundreds, literally hundreds of times, and the view is spectacular. I found the walking conditions abominable. It's smelly, you're right next to the cars and so forth, and the Livable Streets Alliance has this proposal, which I fully agree with. Yes! Make that walking area wider, give me a cycle track next to it, make it a pleasant place to walk, because the view is incomparable. When I'm riding the T over that bridge, I'm like standing next to the windows looking at the view. It's so beautiful. But we could make that walking facility so much nicer. There are many ways to encourage more walking and cycling. I've sort of suggested some already, and it's not just infrastructure. Infrastructure is key. You've got to provide that cycling and walking infrastructure, whether it's crosswalks or better sidewalks or improved signals at intersections or cycle tracks or whatever it might be, bike parking. But there are many other programs you have to do as well. Integrating biking and walking with mass transit, for example, traffic calming of residential neighborhoods, restricting motor vehicle use, traffic education, cycling education, better motorist education. I'll go through each of these in turn rather than just talk about them. I was just in Quebec City, I think it was 5 weeks ago. This was a street that used to have cars on it. Well, they closed it off to cars and made it a pedestrian street. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? Lots of, certainly well used. No one can claim that that street is not well used by pedestrians. That's for sure. It's a very nice street. And you can do similar things right here. This is Winthrop Street. I think it's Winthrop Street. There were two of them that I discovered here in Harvard Square, but I can't remember the name of the other one. But anyway, this is a shared street, so it's very clear that if there's any cars allowed at all, that they go very slowly, that it's mainly meant for pedestrians walking through there or cyclists passing through. Some very nice pedestrian zones in downtown Boston. I went to every single one of them this weekend. I was doing a lot of walking. So you have the downtown crossing and Faneuil Hall and various other markets. I love that one. It's the Monkey Farts Granola. Thinking, has anyone ever bought that? In the upper right, if you look very carefully, I'm thinking, what in the world is that? At any rate, see this, you wouldn't notice this if we're just driving by in a car, but if you walk, you get to see these interesting sorts of things. The interesting thing is, even in a city such as New York, where you'd think it'd be just impossible to do these sorts of things, Broadway was made car-free between Herald Square, which is where Macy's is, and Times Square. Much, much, much more pleasant for pedestrians. There's a cycle track that goes through Times Square as well. And there's a little bit of a problem there because there's so many pedestrians, they overflow onto the cycle track. But at any rate, it's certainly been made a much more pleasant space for pedestrians. They've also taken an abandoned freight line, turned that into a very nice walking facility, and on weekends it's so crowded you can barely move. That's how popular it is. There's a movement here in the United States called Complete Streets, which is saying a street should not just be for cars, it should provide for pedestrians, it should provide also for transit, it should provide for cyclists. And this is a street in Santa Barbara that provides very, very nicely for pedestrians and for cyclists, and happens to provide for cars as well. Nice having the palm trees is there. Makes it look good. This is also in Santa Barbara, and I like what they did because it's indicative of what could be done. I'll put an image, I suppose. I mean, it's of what could be done, a vision of what could be done in many American cities. Where they have that cycle track right now used to be car lane, 2 car lanes. They took away 2 car lanes. They created a wider sidewalk and this cycle track for bikes. Now, again, the palm trees make it look especially good, but I think that's an image or a vision of what we should be, and again, my opinion, I know you may disagree with it, maybe you love your cars and you think priority should be given to cars, but this is, it's a way, an image saying, take away the space from cars and give it to pedestrians and cyclists, which are far, far, far more sustainable modes of transportation. This is an example of a bikeway in Münster, Germany, where I lived for 2.5 years. And you can see a very nice facility here. They also have a separation of pedestrians from cyclists, which, to the extent possible, I think is very desirable. To the right and the left are walking paths. In the center, you have a very nice wide path for cycling. And that's, by the way, that is not mainly a recreational path. It's a circumferential, it's like a beltway for cycling, and so it connects, I don't know how many bike routes coming out from the suburbs going into the center, a very utilitarian path. And here we have the Minuteman Trail. It ends up being the second most popular recreational trail in the United States. But there are also some utilitarian uses of that trail, commuting to work on it as well. One of the nice things I like about the bike paths in the Dutch cities is they're wide enough that you can bike 2 or 3 abreast. You know, bicycling can be a socially sort of pleasant thing. You can bike next to each other and have a conversation. Well, when Ralph Geckenheimer and I were bicycling on Saturday, we had trouble hearing each other because he was ahead of me and I was following him. Well, it would have been much more pleasant if we could have cycled side by side. But the bike path really, or the bike lanes, weren't wide enough to do that. Well, the Dutch, as you can see, provide very nice wide bike paths. This is a bi-directional one, and kids bike alone, and it's really nice. This compliments of my colleague, Peter Forth from Northeastern University. This is a photo of a cycle track in The Hague in the Netherlands, and you can see, if you look carefully, that there is a physical separation. It's not a large concrete barrier, but there's a curb that separates the cyclists from the motor vehicles, and another curb, very slight one, that separates the cyclists from the pedestrians. So again, separation of the cyclists, pedestrians, and the motor vehicles. This one is again from Peter Forth. And here, you know, the cycle tracks, many people, I know in the United States, there's a certain group that opposes cycle tracks, but the Dutch have worked with cycle tracks to overcome whatever dangers there are at intersections. And this is one of the ways they do it. So they have a raised crossing, excellent markage, excellent signage, so that it minimizes the danger that occurs when you have streets crossing cycle tracks. It's not that cycle tracks have no problems, that they're absolutely perfect, but the Dutch have really made an art, a perfection of dealing with cycle tracks so they're much, much safer. In some cases, the road, again, this is from my colleague Peter Forth from Northeastern, and you have advisory bike lanes. This is where the street is too narrow to provide a legally wide enough bike lane, and so you have these red so-called advisory bike lanes, so the bicyclist knows, okay, they can sort of go there, and the cars are meant to watch out for them, but they're not wide enough to be a legally designated bike lane. This is also from Peter Forth. Everything's from Peter. Peter, you should stand up. Where are you? Here you are. Yes. He's the expert here. Now, I am not going to go into great detail. There's the longest chapter in the book, in fact, which is by Peter, is on cycling infrastructure. And it turns out, I mean, the cycle tracks aren't for every single road. Maybe it's a traffic calm street. Maybe on certain light volume roads you want a bike lane. Maybe you want a buffered bike lane. Maybe you want a full cycle track. It really depends. It depends on the volume of traffic, the kind of traffic, the speed of traffic. And what you can see here is there's sort of a Dutch guide to this, and it says the type of facility that you want has to be adjusted to the kind of traffic you're dealing with on that kind of street. So it's not that everything has to be cycle tracks. It may be bike lanes. It may be a traffic calm street. It may be doing nothing to the street if it's a very lightly traveled street in the first place. But I'm not going to go into this in any great detail. Lots and lots of cycle tracks right here in North America, but mainly in Montreal. Montreal has the most cycle tracks of any North American city that I know of, and I was just there 4 weeks ago, and I thought it was very pleasant. There's issues at intersections. It's not perfect. I'm not going to say there's no problems at all, but I found a much higher percentage of women cycling and of seniors and of kids cycling on these cycle tracks than I see on bike lanes in most American cities. So they've been very successful so far as I can tell, and you can see how they've separated. They have bi-directional cycle tracks and very clearly separated by either these bollards, these barriers, or by concrete islands of some sort. There's another cycle track here in Montreal. This is going downhill, getting under the bridge, and here they are coming up. They don't look as happy coming up as they did going down. It gets hot in Montreal, too. Another quick image of a cycle track in Montreal. This happens to be at an intersection which also has Montreal also has the biggest bike sharing program in North America. They have 5,000 bikes, and this happens to be you can see the multimodal nature of the coordination. This is the metro station, the Bixby bike sharing program. You have the cycle track, you have the roads and so forth, and then pedestrians crossing. So I just wanted to show you that combination. I thought it was sort of neat. But you also see, again, if you very carefully, you can see there's that concrete barrier between where the cycle track is and where the traffic is. And so there's a physical separation from the motor vehicle traffic. And you can even do things like this in New York City. There are something like 10 cycle tracks in New York City. This is the one on 9th Avenue. And you can see it had multiple kinds of separation. They have both the bollards, they have the buffer zone, the bollards, they have then a line of parked cars to the right of that. And so you're very insulated, actually, from the moving motor vehicle traffic. Plus, I mean, one of the dangers at intersections for cycle tracks is left-turning cars, getting hooked by a left-turning car. But they deal with this with special signals so that the cyclist is going straight ahead, and this just prohibits the left-hand turn for the motorists, preventing, again, getting hooked by the turning car. You even have a cycle track here on the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., sort of a nice shot with the Capitol in the background. You have 2 cycle tracks, as far as I know so far here in Cambridge, one on Vassar Street and one on Concord Avenue. So we're sort of it's just now starting with the cycle tracks in Cambridge. This is the one that's planned, in case you haven't seen the plans yet. It's a pretty neat plan of having a cycle track on Western Avenue in Cambridge, which will link up evidently with Western Avenue in Boston. So sort of things to come. I think it's already financed. It's planned, it's financed, and will be soon under construction. Or maybe it's already under construction, but it's already under construction? Good. So you will see this coming attraction soon. This is something, actually I was on Beacon Street on one of the bike lanes there, but this is, as you can see actually to the left, the one on Beacon Street, a very highly used facility. The one to the right is on Commonwealth Avenue. I know some people don't like this idea of having the bike lane in the center. And if it were up to me, I must tell you, I would make cycle tracks on both of these. I would take away, I know the motorists won't like me for this, I would take away the parked cars, and I would put in a full cycle track. It could be just one directional for each of these streets, but I would personally prefer having physical separation on streets with as much traffic as Beacon Street in particular. I was very proud of myself that I got through Kendall Square and Beacon Street together with Ralph Gackenheimer on Saturday, alive to tell about it. Okay, so all of these cities, as I say, are doing things. It's not just getting an increase in cycling just because, for whatever reason, they're actually building a lot more bike paths, bike lanes, and it doesn't really distinguish here, but I can tell you that many of these cities, Portland and Washington, D.C., and many of these cities, Montreal and so forth, are putting in cycle tracks as well. You need to have bike facilities to get across rivers or valleys, and so these are 2 examples of bike bridges. This is on the really important getting across, like in this case in Portland, the Willamette River in Portland. They have 5 or 6 or even more bridges. But previously, there were really no cycling facilities on those bridges. Well, they vastly improved the cycling provisions and also pedestrian facilities on these bridges. And they had a huge increase in something like a 7-8-fold increase in the number of bike trips across these bridges. And if I'm not mistaken, this 20,000, this volume of 20,000 cyclists per day is the highest in the United States sort of crossing any particular bridge. It's also important to provide for cyclists and pedestrians when there's construction underway. This is a good example of where they've really provided very, very well for cyclists and pedestrians. I have an Australian friend from Brisbane, and he says he was visiting a number of European cities, says his criterion for whether or not a city really respects cyclists was how they provide for cyclists in construction areas, and this is a pretty good provision. This is a map of Berlin, Germany. And one of the things we're missing, maybe the most important thing we're missing, is we don't really have a network of interconnected, integrated cycling facilities in American cities. There'll be a nice bike path there, and maybe there'll be a nice cycle track there, and a convenient bike lane here, but they generally are not connected. They don't form a network where you can get from one end of the city to the other comfortably and safely on a really safe cycling facility. Well, what you're seeing here in this map of Berlin, everything that's in yellow there, and so with the red lines and so forth, these are actually separate cycling facilities. And on top of that, something like 75% of all of the residential streets in Berlin are traffic calm, 3,800 kilometers. So you actually have almost 4 times as many, and as I mentioned before, this is 30 kilometers an hour or less. So you almost, if you add those 4,000 kilometers to the 1,000 kilometers, 5,000 kilometers of cycling facilities, really. I consider those traffic calm streets every bit as much of a cycling facility as the separate cycling facilities. And they have various ways of doing this. They also have combination bus-bike lanes. But they do train their bus drivers, unlike here in the United States, they train their bus drivers not to run over cyclists. They also have a lot of bus-bike lanes in Paris, in France, if you've ever been there. Priority signals for cyclists, giving them an advanced green light, I think is important. And in many European cities, Dutch, Danish, German cities, the cyclists get the advanced green light, which is important for a number of reasons, but it means they get into the intersection first, so it gives them, they're faster. It also puts them in line of sight of the motorist, which means they're less likely to get hit by the motorist. This is from Portland. Portland has this, they call it the bike scramble, where the light is red for the motorists in all directions, and the cyclists can diagonally cross the intersection. They found out that most cyclists wanted to do that. They didn't want to cross twice, first in one direction and then the other direction. They wanted to cross diagonally. And so they did it, and all you have to put your bike on this little symbol, and the light turns red for the motorist, and it turns green for the cyclist. I thought this was so neat that I did it again and again and again. And I thought the motorists were going to kill me. But there are just some things that are just too neat. Maybe you think I'm sadistic, but I just loved it when the motorists were slowed down. This is an instance of this is a cycle track in Montreal crossing a very busy street, and you can deal with intersections. Again, I'm not going to say that cycle tracks have no problems at intersections, but you can deal with the problems. If you're clever enough, if you have a good enough design, you can deal with it. You give a special signal priority to the cyclist so that even at intersections, clearly there's absolutely no question that between intersections you're safer on a cycle track. But even at intersections, if you design it correctly with the right kind of signage and signaling, it's also safer. You can also have special painting for crossings of intersections that can make it safer. Bike boxes, I've seen a few of these already saw them in Boston. Maybe you have them here in Cambridge as well. I can't remember, but I know seeing them on Sunday in Boston. And again, the issue, if you look at the lower left there, that's Münster, Germany, and you actually see you get an advanced green light. You can't quite see it, but there's a sign that says cyclists should fill up that entire box in front of the cars. You can see the cars having to stop farther back. The cyclists get an advanced stop line, and then they're told on the sign, fill up the entire space of that box. Then the cyclists get an advanced green light. They are through the intersections before the car even starts. I mean, it's safer. It means you're not breathing in that exhaust, and it means you're just more visible to the motorist. The green wave is also another way to encourage more cycling. Instead of timing traffic signals for cars, you time the traffic signal for cyclists. So that if you go at just the right speed, and this is actually in Denmark, they have different speeds for different routes. If it's a really long speed commuter route, they have a higher average speed. If you have a lower speed intercity route, they have a lower speed. But I think it's very considerate setting traffic signals at cyclist speed instead of at motorist speed. This is here in Cambridge, where you have special facilities for getting to the intersection, here for making a left-hand turn. And this one, actually, I just saw about 3 hours ago when I got out of the station at Harvard Square. So this is a special, I'm not sure exactly what you want to call it, a left turn lane or left turn something or other for cyclists, so that you can then make a left turn with a special signal, which you see right there. And I actually stood there for about 5 minutes to see how it worked, and it seemed to work just fine. So you can do various things to facilitate cycling, to make it safer, to make it more convenient, even when you're making a turn, that you are in this case. Traffic calming, I think, is essential. There's lots of forms of traffic calming. It's not just putting up a sign that says maximum 30 kilometers an hour. It's a lot of infrastructure measures that force motorists to slow down. Why do you want motorists to slow down? Because speed kills. and this is from the World Health Organization, so it's a pretty official source, but this is specifically for pedestrians. It turns out that over 30 kilometers an hour, if you're hit by a car, the probability that that pedestrian will be fatally injured goes up exponentially. And so 30 kilometers an hour really is seen in European cities as the key speed, the maximum speed that should be allowed in residential areas. Examples here, this is in Cambridge actually, examples of speed tables, of raised crosswalks, of median islands and so forth, lots of different forms of traffic calming. You can also, I love this one, this is artificial dead ends. This is in Melbourne, Australia, and you can see here it's very easy. There was too much through traffic on this neighborhood street. They were using it as a shortcut to avoid some other major arterial, and the neighborhood residents got together and said, we don't like this. So what did? They got the city to put in this artificial dead end. It's a cut through for cyclists or pedestrians, but it means they completely eliminate the through traffic. Sure, for cars, it means more roundabout routes, but that's great. It makes driving a car more time consuming, less convenient, and it makes cycling and walking faster. This is another form of traffic calming. I took these pictures when I was in Quebec City, and well, actually I didn't take the bottom picture because I'm on the bike on the left. But anyway, you can see just these diverters is what they're called. So it's another kind of, it's like an artificial dead end almost, but it's sort of forcing, in the case to the bottom case, you're forcing the car to turn to the right, whereas the through cut for the cyclist, and in the case up in Quebec City, it forces, you can't see the arrow, but it forces the, well, it forces the car to turn to the left. So again, preventing through traffic in residential neighborhoods, which you don't want there and doesn't belong there anyway. An example of traffic calming in Freiburg, Germany, it doesn't take a gazillion dollars to do this, folks. Look at those, all you put in those bollers, this particular sign is, by the way, it's a Spielstraße. It means a play street, or in Dutch, it's a Woonwerf. It is where the speed limit is reduced to 7 kilometers an hour by law. So it's walking speed. This street, as you can see from the symbol, and they also have signs, you can't see the sign, but this is painted on the pavement, it's for kids playing in the street. It's meant to be an extension of your front yard. So it's for people cycling, for people walking, for kids playing in the street. This street is a shared street. It is not meant to be just for cars. In Portland, what they've done is they've combined traffic calming with, in a way, express bike routes through residential neighborhoods. And the way they do this is they have stop signs for the perpendicular streets, whereas if you're a cyclist on one of these bike boulevards, you very, very rarely have to stop at a stop sign or a red light. And so anyway, this is it's become, I know they have in Portland and Vancouver, all around the country now, they're building these bike boulevards, which is fairly inexpensive. It's just a little bit of a one step beyond the regular kind of traffic calming and adapting it specifically to cycling so that it makes express routes for bikes. Bike transit integration is crucial. I spent the first 20 years of my career, including for my dissertation, looking at public transit. And so I'm not going to say anything against public transit because there are trips that it will simply be too long to make by walking or biking. And it's absolutely crucial to enable someone to, you really have to view public transportation and walking and cycling as sort of a package of modes, of sustainable modes of transportation that sort of work together. And so you need to increase accessibility, both pedestrian accessibility and also cycling accessibility to the public transit stops, whether it's a rail station or a bus stop. In the United States, our main approach to this has been putting bike racks on buses. Something like, I think it's now 80% of the buses in the United States have bike racks. So you can put your bike on the bus and then you continue. This is light rail transit in Minneapolis and in New Jersey. You have these horizontal kinds of racks. This I thought was great. This is on Caltrain in San Francisco, where you have 3 cars, I think it is. It depends on what time of day, but you have 2 or 3 cars that are devoted specifically to parking bikes. That's a lot of bikes. And you can't see it, but there's a second level up there, so the cyclists can sit up there and make sure no one's stealing their bike. Not that any cyclist would ever steal any other cyclist's bike, but anyway, and not only that, these cars, these bicycle cars, are always the ones that are closest to the terminal at the San Francisco end. So another sort of way to make bicycling more convenient. Bike stations, another big movement around the world. There's something over 100 in Germany. There's over 100 in Switzerland, over 100 in the Netherlands. These are full, sort of multi-purpose, sort of full service bike parking facilities. They're guarded, they're sheltered. This one in Münster, Germany has space for 3,500 bikes. It has short-term, medium-term, long-term parking. It has bike repairs. It has bike rentals. It even has a bike wash, believe it or not, which my bike could use. Well, we now have this bike station. Next time you go into Washington, D.C. and you're in Union Station, take a look at the bike station there. It only holds 150 bikes, but it does also have bike repairs and bike rentals and so forth. So at least there's the number of bike stations on. There might be 15 or so in the United States. It's a spreading movement. Here you have I don't like the name bike cages. It doesn't sound very friendly, but at any rate, there's 2 of these at the Alewife station, and so you have, I think it's 300 bike parking spaces in all. But it's another kind of bike transit integration. Here's the main form of bike transit integration in all of Europe. Actually, it's just having bike parking of this sort, unsheltered, at bike racks near the main train station. This one happens to be in Delft in the Netherlands. Another thing you can do, you have to provide bike parking for everyone, not just at transit stops. But what they've done in Portland is, and they might have a few cases here in Cambridge as well, but these things called bike corrals, where you take 2 or 3 car parking spaces and you turn them into bike parking. And they've been so popular in Portland that they have a long waiting list of commercial operations, cafes, restaurants, you name it, stores, which are asking to the city, please take away our car parking and give us bike parking instead, because that's what's going to get us customers. So it's not something that the city is imposing on anyone. It's something that's a sort of a grassroots demand. We want more bike parking and less car parking. Bike sharing is another really big movement. There's a whole chapter in the book on bike sharing by Susan Shaheen at the University of California, Berkeley. And you've probably all heard about the famous Velib bike sharing program in Paris with over 20,000 bikes. There's also an even older, actually, bike sharing system in Germany run by the German railways called Callabike. You have bike sharing, the Hubway system here in Cambridge. You have Nice Ride in Minneapolis. You have Capital Bike Share in Washington, D.C. And next year, we're supposed to get, anyway, City Bike in New York City, which will have almost 10,000 bikes. Traffic education, I'm almost finished, don't worry. I know I'm getting over time, but let me continue here, which is a few more, I think, absolutely essential programs to complement some of these other physical sort of infrastructure issues of bike parking and bike facilities. And that is, I think, that something as crucial as motorist training. Most states, each state has its own standards for motorist training, but in the United States, they're generally very lax. I can prove this because I have a driver's license. And there is no way in this wide world I should. I took my driver's training, well, I had free driver's training in the high school in North Carolina, where I grew up. And for my driver's test, all I had to do was drive once around the parking lot and diagonally park, and he said, "You've passed the test." And I said, "You're kidding." And I've never had to take the driving portion of the test again. So if you ever see me behind the wheel of a car, stay off the roads. But when we have a lot of European students at our program at the Rutgers University in New Jersey, and they think, I mean, they get it, many of them at American licenses, driver's licenses, and they say it's a joke. They just can't believe how easy it is. It costs in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and Sweden over $2,000 to get your driver's license. Over $2,000. I'll tell you why later if you're interested. But anyway, it's very expensive and very difficult. The co-editor of our book, Ralph Bewley, he failed the test twice. He failed the test because he did not demonstrate during the driving portion. He was anticipating the possibility of endangering a pedestrian who was on the sidewalk. I mean, if we had that standard in the United States, no one would pass the driver's license test. The other issue, however, is that I think is really important and is totally lacking not totally lacking, but 95% or 99% lacking in the United States, is traffic safety lessons. I mean, cycling as well as walking in the schools. It should be compulsory. It is compulsory in German schools, in Danish schools, in Dutch schools. And this is why every boy, every girl, by the 3rd or 4th grade has had extensive training in safe walking and cycling. And I think it's really important. What I've seen in New York City, and yes, here in Boston and Cambridge, is a lot of running of red lights and stop signs and doing really dangerous things on the part of cyclists and pedestrians, and motorists, of course, as well. But I mean, part of the problem is educating the motorists, but another part is educating the cyclists and the pedestrians, because it's their responsibility too to walk and cycle in a responsible way. But they have to have that training. This is downloaded from the driver's license training test actually for Germany. And it's a multiple choice question. You see these photographs and it says, well, what should you do in each of these circumstances? Well, the top two and the lower left are clear. It's just yield to the pedestrian. Okay, there's a car, the pedestrian is crossing in front of you. There's a cyclist. You yield to the pedestrian. You yield to the cyclist. The one to the lower right was a mystery to me. I said, Ralph? Ralph was the one who downloaded this for me. I said, what's that all about? What are you supposed to do? What's the question about? And he said, and this is where he confessed that he failed the test twice. He said that the right answer is you are supposed to, as a motorist, anticipate the possibility of that kid riding out into the street without looking and without seeing you driving as a motorist. And if you hit that car, it is by law your fault. So if you hit a child or a senior, cyclist or pedestrian, it is automatically by law the fault of the motorist. And it is your responsibility as a motorist to anticipate that possibility of endangering a cyclist or a pedestrian. Very different. I don't think that Boston motorists would pass this test. I don't think they would get that point. This is just simply demonstrating again the extensive traffic safety education. First, they take the kids on the sort of a test course with the bikes, sort of closed off to actual traffic. Then they go with a real police officer onto the streets with real traffic, and they have to pass a test. They get a certificate, they get a pennant to put on the wall, a sticker for their bike, and they're very proud of doing well on this test. But it means every single boy, every girl, by the 3rd or 4th grade has had this training in safe walking and safe cycling. This is the way the Dutch get to school, and you can see that conveniently they have a cycle track right next leading to the school, and then they have lots of good bike parking. I'm not sure it's so good, but they have bike parking right at the school. There are actually bike training courses for kids. This is the one that I've got photos for New Jersey, but maybe 1% of kids have this sort of bike training. It's just minuscule because it's not compulsory. You can have bike training for adults. There's almost every city. You can find some sort of there's effective cycling classes and so forth run by the League of American Bicyclists. But a very small percentage of Americans take these courses. And if we started out in the schools by the 3rd or 4th or 5th grade and requiring people to take these safe cycling and walking classes, it would be much more effective. Other ways to promote cycling and walking are various events, such as in New York City you have summer streets. And you can see here, actually I was walking, actually taking this particular photograph. That's Grand Central Station. So Park Avenue gets closed down to traffic from top to bottom. And you have 200,000 participants, and it's just a great event, a really promotion of cycling. And you can do it right here in the Boston area as well. This is in Somerville, and very appropriately named Summer Streets, and I believe that is the mayor of Somerville to the right of the photograph. It's just you make it a fun sort of a thing to do. Lots of different cities around the country, Chicago, San Francisco, Portland, lots and lots of different cities now have these sort of fun events days where they close off streets to cars, and they make it for pedestrians and cyclists and skateboarders or whatever. You can have family bike rides, group bike rides of various kinds, just to encourage people. You don't want to do it by yourself, especially if you're starting out. It makes it more fun. You feel safer. You feel more comfortable. It's a more social environment. It makes it a sort of a fun event. You can have special tours for seniors like me. So everyone's going to cycle as slowly as I do. I've been clocked by the speed indicator in New Jersey at 10 miles an hour. I think that's probably tops for me. Conclusions. We're almost at the end. First of all, there are all sorts of reasons for promoting walking and cycling. We're not just doing this for the heck of it. There's so many benefits of walking and cycling. I mean, they're environmentally friendly, they're healthy. I think they make cities more livable. I think they make cities and our whole society more just. I really do. I think it gives a much more equality in terms of mobility for both genders, for different age groups, and kids, by the way. I mean, kids are our future. And I think it's a really bad sign that such an increasing percentage of kids, it's like now over 70% of kids, are chauffeured to school by their parents. Well, they're losing that physical activity, they're losing that independence, they're losing that mobility. They don't have that time to do whatever they want to do on their own. I think that's something really that's important to consider, the future of our children, but also the future us, senior citizens, we want to be able to get around without having to be chauffeured around by other people with cars. So there's many, many benefits, and the good news is there's lots of ways to do this. It's not a mystery. It's not a secret. You can actually look at the ways cities have successfully increased walking and cycling and made walking and cycling safer. You can do it. And there are many examples, even right here in North America, even right here in Cambridge and in Boston and in other cities in the United States, where you can see what works and what doesn't work. And if you want to know more details, this is that book. In terms of cycling, at least, we go into all the details of children and cycling and women and cycling, the infrastructure chapter by our colleague here, Professor Forth, and many other chapters as well. I'm not going to go through these measures. These are basically the whole list of what are there, 10 different kinds of measures we discuss in much more detail in the book in terms of increasing cycling. Most of these are non-brainers. I mean, I sort of discussed in some way or other many of these different measures. The key thing, and this is the absolute last slide, because at the end of every session, it's happened in Quebec City, it happened in Montreal, it's happened in Toronto, it's happened in Portland, it's happened in every city that I've given this talk in the United States, is that's all very well and good. We agree, we want to increase walking and cycling. Yeah, we'd like better bicycling facilities, better walking facilities, better sidewalks, better intersection design. How do we do this? How do we actually get these things implemented? The political implementation question is really the most important and maybe the most difficult question of all. How do we get the public support and the political support to get these measures implemented? How do we get space reallocated from motor vehicles to pedestrians and cyclists? And I think one of the key ways, we list here 7 different ways and discuss each of them in detail in the book, but one of the key ways, I think, is emphasizing the health benefits of walking and cycling. There was a study done by one public health expert that was published in the American Journal of Public Health, and it showed that for every hour you walk or cycle, you add more than an hour to your expected healthy lifetime. That's your lifetime without a major disability. I repeat, for every hour you spend walking or cycling, you add more than an hour to your expected healthy lifetime. Now, that should be that's a very strong incentive at the individual level and for parents in terms of their kids to get more people walking and cycling. There are tremendous, tremendous health benefits of walking and cycling, even if you couldn't care less about the environment, even if you couldn't care less about congestion or all the other supposed benefits of walking and cycling, even if you only care about your own selfish benefits. You can argue, you get out there on that bike or get out there on your feet, and you are going to be healthier and you're going to live longer. And by the way, you're going to save money at the same time and have a lot of fun. And let me stop on that. Okay. Does someone else want to be in charge of answering? Okay. Who would like to ask a question? Yes.
I definitely agree with you that cycling is a social justice issue. And I was very much struck by the DC neighborhood map, and partly New York and Boston as well. But any comparison between Northwest DC and Anacostia reveals. Oh. Okay, I'll start again. I entirely agree with you that bicycling is a social justice issue. And I was very struck in the DC map, and partly as well in New York and Boston, but particularly in DC, if there is a huge cycling disparity between Northwest and Anacostia, that these are very racially different neighborhoods. And what are the sort of policy implications for racial disparities in cycling, and how do those need to make it somewhere on this list?
Yeah, actually, while we're at it, maybe I can get back to that map because it is striking. I'll tell you now that there are almost no cycling facilities at all in Anacostia. Let me see how far back we have to go. There's probably a better way to do this, but we will eventually get there because it is actually an extremely good question. Oops, there. You have to get by bridge. unless you take the metro, which, by the way, during peak hours, you can't take the bikes on the metro. So there's almost no cycling facilities on the bridges getting over to Anacostia, and there's almost no cycling facilities in Anacostia. So in fact, the Washington Area Bicycling Coalition has a whole program called Cycling East of Anacostia. And their whole meeting east of the Anacostia River. And so they're trying to develop better cycling facilities, improve the cycling facilities on the bridges to get to Anacostia. It's even in the whole southeast. It's not even just Anacostia. Then also to the whole southeast there is a more African-American sort of counties and lower income counties. And so it's a matter, it's a real problem. If you look also at the map of New York, if you look at the areas where you have the highest level of cycling, those are not low-income areas. They're sort of where all the hipsters and the yuppies, like me, I'm a hipster, you see. All the hipsters and the yuppies and sort of these are pretty affluent areas now. Whereas if you go to, say, eastern Queens, eastern Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island, it's a very different sort of a population. And all of the best cycling facilities are there in lower Manhattan and in northwest Brooklyn. And so you see this disparity in many, many cities, I think. So then the issue is, well, why aren't we building the really high quality cycle track facilities in the lower income minority neighborhoods? So I think there's an issue of equity there. Now, what they would argue in New York is, well, that's sort of they think that the hipsters and the yuppies are the most likely to get on their bikes. And so that's where they're going to sort of start off. And then they have plans for stage 2 and stage 3 and stage 4. So you can hope they'll get to stage 3 and stage 4. But at this particular moment, I think there is an inequity there because they're not providing the same quality or quantity of cycling facilities or pedestrian facilities, by the way, in those the minority neighborhoods and lower income neighborhoods. I mean, really some very high fatality rates for pedestrians as well as cyclists in those outer areas of the city. Yes.
Thank you for this lecture. I would like to add another component which I think is very relevant locally here. The Charles River Conservancy has been advocating for underpasses along the Charles River. Thank you. To have the pathways along the Charles River as the bridges cross the Charles, to have underpasses. And just in the last few days, the runners have joined this effort of underpass advocacy. I think over 1,000 letters in the last 2 weeks have been sent to the governor and appointed officials by runners. The Cambridge Running Club has taken the lead, and many other running clubs have done that. So the advocacy for underpasses that would benefit bicycling, walking, but also running. So I think there's a whole other advocacy group there that can help the effort of bicyclists. And I want to thank all of those who have supported the underpasses. We're making good progress. I think people are getting the message. So include the runners in this picture.
I can tell you that in Munster, there's a river such as this, and always they have the underpasses that you would love. I mean, you're not having to go up and over and crossing the street. The underpasses are there. It makes it convenient. It's easier, and I think it's safer as well. So I'll sign that letter as well.
Thank you.
Yes, Ralph.
John, close by this slide, you showed us one of Boston, Metropolitan area. To me, that
This one?
the,
Or- this is cycling, and that's, wait, which one is which? I can't read. That's walking. You want to see the one for cycling?
yeah.
Okay.
It seemed to me hard to see in the light now that the peaks of bicycle portions of travel by bicycle were more widely distributed than in other cities. It
Yeah.
may be a result of the scale of the maps, but it looks like cycle use is more widespread in the Boston metropolitan area. And I'm wondering if that's a inheritance from the development of a number of metropolitan towns, each of which has some density to it, and therefore is a prompt to land use planning behind the promotion of cycling.
Good question. It was also my impression when I saw these maps. It looks like it's more widely spread out. I don't see the concentration. Looking back at this map of New York, I mean, it is just super, super concentrated. I mean, like everything is yellow except a very small portion, whereas when I look at the map, is that the one for cycling? Okay, that's the one for cycling. It does look like it's more spread out. Very kindly, David from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council produced these maps. These are based on census tracts. I mean, it's the same source, by the way, of information, exactly the same as the American Community Surveys, the U.S. Census, and it's a 5-year running average to increase the size of the sample. And I would ask David if he could possibly do it on the PUMA basis, which is a larger spatial unit, which we used for the New York map and for the DC map, but it takes a long time, and the staff simply couldn't do it. So I'm not really sure, because they weren't able to produce the maps using the PUMA as the spatial basis, which I can't even remember what PUMA refers to, but it's a larger spatial sort of unit. It's hard. I think if you were to look at the same map on census tract basis for Manhattan, that you would probably see it a little bit more dispersed as well. I think part of it may be due to that, but I don't really know. I tried to get it on the basis of PUMAs. I've got that for San Francisco, and for Los Angeles, and Santa Barbara, and New York, but I don't have it for this. Yes?
I am a pedestrian advocate, and I am concerned that what I see happening often is that the infrastructure for bikes is not coming out of cars, but coming out of pedestrian infrastructure. I mean, I see that in real life. More people are riding bikes on the sidewalks, so the sidewalks become less safe to walk on. For example, I work in Arlington, and when they were talking about what can we do about the big Arlington Center cross, which is, if anyone's done it, is blood-curdling by all modes of transit, they're talking about, oh, well, we could have a cycle cross straight across on a diagonal, and I said, every pedestrian I know is going to use that, right? And they were like, oh, hadn't thought of that. You know, like, well, think of it. I use the Minuteman bike path to walk on, and there is a lot of bike-pedestrian conflict. And I don't want to see that, and I don't want to see, you know, bike infrastructure coming out of pedestrian infrastructure, which we have precious little of anyway. So what do we do to get both? Because they cannot be together. Bikes and pedestrians go at different speeds, just as bikes and cars. We have to have three. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, well, I'd say do what the Dutch and the Danes do, and that is just what you've suggested, maximum possible separation. I mean, you're right. I mean, you can't always do it. I mean, even on mixed-use paths, I find there's conflicts constantly between pedestrians and cyclists. They're going at different speeds, and then when I find a pedestrian who's, by the way, I'm every much of a pedestrian as a cyclist. I mean, I walk half of the time, I cycle half of the time, so I really do see both sides of this. But as a cyclist, if I have a pedestrian in front of me who has an iPod on, and I can ring my bell 1,000 times, I just don't hear it. It makes it dangerous. But then also I see cyclists who don't have bells on and don't let the pedestrians know that they're coming by. But the real solution to this is, and it's not always possible, but it's what the Danes and the Dutch do, maximum possible separation. There's simply different speeds, different operating characteristics. Pedestrians have very unpredictable movements and so forth. And I completely agree. I don't think that cycling improvements should be made at the expense of pedestrians. I'm not sure if you remember the map, or let's go back to it because I think it's sort of important. Let's see where we have it. Nope, here. It's hard to see in this light. There's 10 times more walk trips than there are bike trips in the United States. We have 1% of all trips in the United States are by bike. This is all trip purposes. And we have about 12% of all trips are by walking. And at the beginning, at the very outset of this talk, I said that I thought that walking and cycling had been terribly neglected modes of transportation. I would go further and say nothing has been more neglected than walking. Nothing. I don't know. Walkers just aren't as well organized. There's something about it. I don't know. I was the guy who was the head of Walk Sydney. I took a walk with him around on the Sydney Harbor. And he said, well, walking is like breathing. It's hard to organize pedestrians into a really effective unit, whereas for whatever reason, cyclists tend to be very well organized. But the point is, I think walking is really important. The other issue is virtually everyone walks. I mean, it's very rare. I mean, I don't know what percentage of the population, even if you're walking to your car, or if you're walking to the transit station, for example, over 90% of all trips to bus stops and rail stations are by walking. And so if you want to get transit, this is why I'm saying there are three modes. If you want to encourage public transportation, you better make walking safer too, because 90% of your passengers are getting to your transit stops by walking. I can tell you that in New Jersey, I'm not sure, it's probably not as bad here in the Boston area, walking to some bus stops and rail stations is absolutely death-defying. No sidewalks, really dangerous. And so I'm going on and on and on. But the real, I guess I want to make the point that I agree with you. Walking is extremely important. It tends to get neglected. And I'm all for improving facilities for cycling, but I really don't want that to come at the expense of making things more dangerous for pedestrians, because I'm both. Yes.
I've got the mic here. Do you mind if I just ask mine first? Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
He
Oh,
gave me the mic.
fine, go ahead.
A
Take
couple.
it.
This
I'm
is,
sorry.
I think, a pretty quick one though.
Oh, two more questions. I've been just told two more
A
questions.
couple slides before or after this one, you showed some comparisons between injuries and fatalities.
We'll
in,
get to it. I will find
North
it, because that's an
American and
important
European
slide.
cities. The one thing I found interesting about it is the rate of fatality and
Trina.
injury. It may have been that one.
Yes.
In the Netherlands and Denmark were roughly the same if you're hit by an automobile in either of those two countries, where in the U.S., getting hit by an automobile, of course, obviously both those numbers are far, far too high, but the incidence of injuries is so much higher than fatality. I'm just wondering, it seems like something's happening in either of those two countries when a cyclist is hit by a car. They're dying 50% of the time. I'm wondering if you had any potential explanation for that.
I really don't. I can tell you that the injury statistics in the United States are insane. There's two completely different sets of statistics. One is from the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's called FARS, which is, I don't know what it means, something or other. But anyway, it's the official source of statistics from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The other source is from CDC. And the CDC reports rates of cyclist injuries that are 100 times higher than the rates reported by the U.S. Department of Transportation. So getting really good, this is why I would tend to more focus on the fatalities, because I think those numbers are more reliable. It's not that injuries aren't important. There's many, many more injuries than there are fatalities. But the injury data is less comparable from country to country. But not only that, even within the United States, it's difficult to get comparable data on injuries. How do you define an injury? I can tell you that USDOT data comes from police reports. The CDC data comes from emergency rooms of hospitals. And they use different criteria as to how serious is an injury. It's just very, very different numbers, and which is why I'm a little bit dubious myself. I mean, this is what the official statistic, this is from the FARS data, by the way, which understates.
Point out the difference in scale for
It goes off the graph.
But the killed is per 100 million kilometers, while the injured is per 10 million kilometers.
Right, there's different scales
When
completely.
they show up looking equal, they're not equal. It's 10 to 1.
Okay, that answers the question. Peter, I'm so glad you're here. I think we have one more question. Okay.
Hi. So North America can be representative of many climate situations. I want to ask you if there are any policies or urban form built environment measures that could be taken for extreme measures that would not allow for biking or walking, such as snow, rainfall, excessive solar radiation, and the like.
I'm not exactly sure what your question is. That is,
So
repeat it.
let me give you an example. In Seattle, there are awnings all the time, so people tend to walk very comfortably. When in London, people don't walk because it's raining all the time, and they are not really comfortable in walking in the rain. Are there any formal policies that you are aware of that would promote walking and biking through the preventive measures against climate
I don't see how you can change the climate. I mean, we have climate change, but that is, I mean, that is, as a matter of fact, this is, let me make 3 points. One is San Francisco and Seattle are among the hilliest of American cities, and they have 2 of the highest rates of cycling. Portland and Vancouver, as well as Seattle, have some of the rainiest climates in the entire, all of North America, and they have among the highest levels of cycling. And then in terms of coldest cities, if you look at Montreal, Ottawa, and Quebec City, and Minneapolis, they're among the coldest cities of the United States, and they have among the highest level of cycling. So I guess my conclusion would be, I don't think, obviously there's, other things being equal, I would rather cycle on a sunny day when it's 75 degrees and it's flat. But having hills, having rain, and having a cold season, such as I have in Minneapolis, does not deter a cycling culture. I think that policies, as you can see, what Portland is doing, or Seattle, or San Francisco, or Minneapolis. I mean, Montreal could just give up and say, you know, we're just too cold. It's just not a place to cycle. Well, they don't. They do everything conceivable to make cycling feasible. And then in the winter, they walk underground with their underground system. So I really don't think that, and if you look at a country-by-country basis as well, Switzerland and Austria have some of the highest levels of cycling. They're not exactly flat. The Netherlands, Belgium, northern Germany, Denmark are quite rainy, sort of like the northwest of here in the United States, and yet they have the highest levels of cycling. So again, I really don't think that topography and climate are tremendous deterrents to cycling, because you can see such counter examples where you have very high rates of cycling in spite of bad climates, very cold climates, rainy climates, and very hilly topography. And in San Francisco, the topography becomes a challenge. It's sort of a neat thing. Oh, I'm a cyclist, and you know, I can get up those hills too. Of course, they also have the squiggles that you get around the hills. Okay, I think that's the last question. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. And the best thing you can do to say thank you is walk and bike. And when you're driving, don't run us over.